Cartethyia has been in the game for a little while now, and she's quickly become one of my favourite units to play, especially during exploration. She brings a lot of unique things we haven't seen any other characters do yet, a few of which have me hyped for what sort of kits we'll see in future characters. So in this video, I want to go over a kit, talk about her weapon and sequences, go over her builds and teams, and finally give my thoughts on the character, including the issues that I encountered, any tips and tricks that I've found, and whether I would recommend pulling for her or not. Now, there's a lot to talk about with Cartethyia's kit, so I'm going to try and break it down as best I can. However, there's going to be a lot of information, so I'll make sure to put chapters on this video, and if something's too boring, please feel free to skip ahead. But something I'm going to mention at the start so that I don't have to mention it repeatedly, all of Cartethyia's attack scale off her max HP, and most of her attack scale off her basic attack damage. So instead it'll be a lot easier if I mention which abilities don't scale off basic attack. But with that out of the way, let's get into her kit. Cartethyia's basic attack chain is a 4-part combo, with the first 2 parts being sword slashes, followed by a quick multi-hit combo, and finally a medium-ranged multi-hit attack. Her basic attack 4 will place 1 stack of arrow erosion on any enemies hit by the final strike. Arrow erosion stacks will last for 15 seconds, stack up to 3 times, and the amount of tick damage arrow erosion does will scale off the amount of stacks the enemy has. If the duration of the stack expires, this will cause the whole stack to disappear. However, the stack duration can be refreshed by reapplying arrow erosion again. Her basic attack 4 will also spawn a sword that falls on the target. However, we'll talk about what this is called and how it's relevant when we get to her forte. What we'll say for now though is this is the second sword you can see on her forte gauge. Her heavy attack will spawn a small black hole directly in front of Cartethyia, drawing in enemies in a short range around it before doing a small explosion. This will also cause the first sword to fall at the black hole's location and can also be cast mid-air. Her plunge attack will have her plunge her sword into the ground, doing a short ranged attack around her once she lands. This will lead into her basic attack 2 and is another ability that will be very relevant once we get to her forte. Her dodge counter is the same as her basic attack 3, but will deal more damage. This attack will also lead into her basic attack 4. Cartethyia's skill will lift her into the air, doing a short-ranged AoE attack around her that will cause the third sword to fall at the center of this attack. Enemies hit by the final hit of this attack will have 2 stacks of arrow erosion applied to them, and will also leave Cartethyia mid-air, floating on a small platform above the ground. This will consume stamina for as long as she's in this state, but it will also expire naturally after a short duration. This floating state is considered the same as being airborne and can trigger a plunge attack, a heavy attack, or fun fact, if you wait for long enough, you can use her skill again out of this state, as it can also be used mid-air. Her skill has a cooldown of 14 seconds. Lastly, her intro skill will have her attack with 3 small orbs before the first sword falls to her left. This attack will lead into her basic attack 2 and is not considered as basic attack damage. These are all of Cartethyia's abilities, so let's talk about her forte. Her forte gauge consists of 3 swords that she can create from doing certain attacks. Discord, which is spawned from her intro skill and heavy attack, Divinity, which is spawned from her basic attack 4, and Virtue, which is spawned from her skill. Each sword will be on the field for 20 seconds before they'll disappear, and only one of each type can exist at once. However, the sword just being on the field doesn't do anything for Cartethyia on its own, so she needs to recall them to gain their respective buffs. She can do this by performing a plunge attack while in range of a sword, which will cause it to be recalled and charge the respective symbol on her forte gauge. This will trigger an enhanced plunge attack at the target's location that will change depending on how many swords were recalled. If a single sword is recalled, this will cause that sword to fall on the target. If 2 swords are recalled, this will cause a giant blade attack out of the ground at the target's location. If all 3 swords are recalled, this will cause a much harder hitting and flashier version of the giant sword attack. The damage from this ability is considered as both basic and arrow erosion damage. When there are no swords in range, the respective symbol on her forte gauge will be greyed out. When she is within range of a sword, the symbol will light up with a pulsing effect on either side. And when a sword has been recalled, the small lines on either side will disappear, and it will instead be surrounded by a swirling effect. Once a sword has been recalled, it can be recreated and recalled once again. Each recalled sword will provide certain buffs during her manifest state from her liberation, which we'll talk about next. However, these sword buffs will not expire until you use her liberation and the manifest state ends. So let's talk about her liberation now. Her first liberation ability will not deal any damage and will instead transform her into Fleurdelys and reduce her HP to 50% of its max. If her current health is 50% or less, this will not consume any HP. In her liberation state, all of her abilities will change from her Cartethyia abilities to her Fleurdelys abilities. But before we get into those, let's talk about some general knowledge for her Fleurdelys state. Fleurdelys has her own forte gauge that we'll talk about at the end, but while this isn't full, she will have access to the liberation ability called Avatar. This will allow her to switch back to Cartethyia, doing her basic attack 2 if it's used on the ground, or her plunge attack if it's used in the air. She will also enter the manifest state for 12 seconds at the start of the transformation. While in manifest, Cartethyia's liberation ability will also change into Avatar, which on use will change her back into Fleurdelys, performing her basic attack 2 if she's on the ground, or her mid-air attack 1 if she's in the air. This allows you to switch between them freely and perform whatever combos you need to. When you switch to Cartethyia during manifest, its 12-second duration will be paused until you switch back to Fleurdelys. Now, the description for this ability does say the pause is triggered when you use Avatar to switch back to Cartethyia. However, if you swap to her using an unconventional method like a grappling hook or a glider, this will also pause manifest duration. However, staying as Fleurdelys and swapping to another character will not pause the duration. So the best way to consider this ability is manifest duration will only be active for as long as Fleurdelys is. Two good ways to tell if manifest is active or it's about to expire. Her forte gauge will flash shortly before it expires, and while in manifest, the avatar ability will get a white effect around the edge of the ability. One thing that I'll make sure to mention here is her Fleurdelys form and manifest are not the same thing, as you can remain as Fleurdelys permanently until you use an ability that switches you back to Cartethyia. If manifest expires and you use the avatar ability, this will switch her back to Cartethyia, but you won't be able to swap back to Fleurdelys. Avatar has a cooldown of 1.5 seconds and it can be cast mid-air. While playing as Fleurdelys and manifest is still active, the buffs from any swords you've recalled will also become active. The Discord buff will cause some of Fleurdelys' attacks to match the amount of air erosion stacks on an enemy to whichever enemy among those hit has the highest amount of air erosion stacks. For an example, if you hit 4 enemies with one of these attacks and most of the enemies have 0 stacks but one of them has 3, after this attack, all of the enemies will all have 3 stacks of air erosion. I'm going to refer to this as spreading erosion. The divinity buff will amplify air erosion damage by 50% and will also cause air erosion stacks within a certain range of Fleurdelys to proc twice as often. And lastly, the virtue buff will cause her basic attack 4 to stagnate enemies' hit bite for a short period of time, as well as increase her resistance to interruption. Another thing to mention about Fleurdelys, some of her attacks will prematurely trigger the damage of air erosion, which will be the same amount of damage as a single tick from the debuff, and will also reduce the amount of stacks the enemy has by 1. I'll refer to this as triggering a stack. With that out of the way, let's go over Fleurdelys' attacks. Her basic attack chain is a 5-part sword combo, with the final hit causing a large sword to fall on the target, dealing damage in a medium-ranged AoE. Her basic attack 4 is the only attack that takes advantage of the virtue buff, which will stagnate the enemy for a short period of time. And the final hit from her basic attack 5 will both trigger a stack as well as spread erosion. Her regular jump ability is replaced with an attack that has her move towards the target doing an upward slash, launching herself and some smaller enemies into the air. Once in the air, she can perform her mid-air attacks, which is a 3-part attack combo. The first part will do 3 sword slashes that will send out blade waves either in a straight line or towards the current target. The second part will do 2 medium-range slashes that will both trigger a stack as well as spread erosion. And the last attack will have her do a plunging stab attack towards the enemy. If the attack button is held down while mid-air, this will perform the plunging attack. Her heavy attack is a two-part combo that will first do a dashing stab attack that can act as a pretty good gap closer. If this is followed up with a basic attack, this will have her do what is called her enhanced heavy attack, where she'll dash backwards as she shoots a blade towards the target, which will spread erosion. After this, you can do another basic attack to trigger her launch attack, which will be followed by her mid-air combo. Her dodge counter is a stronger version of her basic attack 3 that will lead into her basic attack 4. However, she can also dodge attacks in the air, and doing so will reset her mid-air combo to mid-air attack 1. However, unlike most dodge counters, this will not give iframes and doesn't do any more damage than her regular mid-air attack. Her skill has two uses. The first use will have her float into the air and attack the target with a medium-ranged black hole attack that will pull in smaller enemies. Once in the air, she can do any of her mid-air attack combos. However, for a short period of time after using her skill, a second skill will also become available. This will have her do a ground slam attack, doing damage in a medium-ranged AoE that will both trigger a stack as well as spread erosion. There's a few things to mention here. Both of her skills are some of the few attacks that are not considered as basic attack damage and are instead considered skill damage. They can both be used mid-air, and if her first skill is used while performing her mid-air combo, this will reset her mid-air combo to mid-air attack 1. Her first skill has a cooldown of 14 seconds. Her second skill will be available for 8 seconds after you use her first skill, and if you switch to another character while her second skill is available, it will no longer be available when you swap back. However, this is not the case when switching between Fleurdelys and Cartethyia. Fleurdelys' intro skill will have her do a dashing stab attack that also generates Forte. This will lead into her basic attack 2 and is not considered as basic attack damage. Lastly, let's talk about her Forte and her ultimate liberation attack. All of Fleurdelys' attacks will generate conviction for her Liberation Forte gauge when they hit an enemy. Once this gauge is full, this will replace her Liberation's avatar ability with her ultimate Liberation attack, Blade of Howling Squall, where she'll raise her blade above her head before bringing it down to nearly split the world in two as it deals massive damage to all enemies in a straight line in front of her. This will remove all stacks of air erosion from any target's hit, which will amplify the damage dealt by this attack by 20% for each stack removed, up to a maximum of 5 stacks. This will end Manifest, transform her back into Cartethyia, heal her for 50% of her max health, and is considered as liberation damage. Both Cartethyia and Fleurdelys' liberation abilities have separate cooldowns of 25 seconds and can both be used mid-air. Her outro skill will amplify aero damage dealt by her team by 17.5% for 20 seconds against enemies inflicted with negative statuses. This only applies to her team and not to herself. Her first inherent skill will increase the healing received for her team by 20%, as well as increase their resistance to interruption. This again only applies to her team. If Aero Rover happens to be in the team, this will also have Rover restore 25 Forte when they use their liberation. Her second inherent skill will increase the damage dealt by both Cartethyia and Fleurdelys against enemies with one or more stacks of Aero Erosion by 30%. This will increase by an additional 10% for each stack over 3, up to a maximum of 30%, or 60% total at 6 stacks. That's her kit. So let's finally move on to her sequences and her weapon. Her S1 will give a buff called Zeal for 10 seconds when either Cartethyia or Fleurdelys defeat an enemy inflicted with aero erosion. While in the Zeal state, the next attack that hits enemies will place aero erosion stacks onto all enemies hit, equal to the same stack count as the defeated enemy who had the highest number of stacks. This can't exceed the aero erosion cap and will remove Zeal, putting it on a 1 second cooldown. The first half of her S1 can be really useful for multiple waves of enemies, as you can transfer the aero erosion stacks from one wave to the next. However, the second part of her S1 will give Fleurdelys 25% more crit rate for 15 seconds for each quarter of her Liberation Forte gauge filled. This can stack up to 4 times and will be removed after casting her ultimate Liberation attack. This is an insanely good sequence overall, not only giving some quality of life improvements that are useful in modes like Whimpering Waste, but also a massive damage boost to her Liberation state, as once all 4 stacks are obtained, this will give a total of 100% crit damage boost for 15 seconds. Her S2 will increase the max stack limit of air erosion by 3 for enemies within a certain range after casting her transformation Liberation. This will also make the first attack in her Liberation state inflict 3 more stacks of air erosion to all enemies hit, as well as immediately proc them without consuming any stacks. This sequence will also increase the damage multiplier of Cartethia's basic attacks, heavy attacks, dodge counter and intro skills by 50%, as well as increase the damage multiplier of her plunge attack by 200%. It will also reduce the cooldown of her skill by 1 for each sword recalled by her plunge attack. This is yet again an insanely strong sequence, turning her into an absolute powerhouse. Her S3 will make Fleurdelys' basic attack 5, mid-air attack 2, enhanced heavy attack, as well as her second skill, inflict 2 stacks of air erosion to targets they hit. This will also increase the damage multiplier of her final Liberation ability by 100%. This is a really good sequence for future-proofing her, which can also make her useful without characters like Shakona. Her S4 is a universal damage buff, giving a team-wide 20% damage bonus to all attributes for 20 seconds whenever someone in the team inflicts a negative status effect. Her S5 gives her a death save when taking lethal damage, giving her a shield equal to 20% of her maximum health for 10 seconds, and will also reduce the amount of health consumed by her transformation ability to 25% of her max health. This is an incredibly good sequence for survivability, making it very difficult for enemies to kill her. Lastly, her S6 will have her final Liberation ability increase the amount of air erosion stacks to max for all enemies hit, as well as no longer consuming them after the attack. This will also have both of her intro skills, Transformation Liberation and Ultimate Liberation abilities, make it so that when any character in the team inflicts air erosion on an enemy with already max stacks, it will immediately trigger the damage of the stack, as well as cause the target to take 40% more damage from Fleurdelys. This buff will last for 30 seconds. So now let's talk about her signature weapon. Her weapon is an insanely good option for her, having low base attack which she doesn't need anyway, but giving a massive 72.2% HP on the substat, as well as 12 to 24% HP in the passive. It will also cause attacks within 15 seconds of an intro skill or basic attacks to ignore 8 to 16% of the enemy's defense, and if they have at least 1 stack of air erosion, the damage they take is also amplified by 20%. This is an insanely strong weapon for Cartethyia and will massively increase her damage. However, should you pull for it or any of her sequences? Her signature is a massive benefit to not only her survivability, but also her damage output being a much better option to pull for than her sequences. However, it is also an incredibly niche weapon, requiring a character to scale off HP in some way to be able to take advantage of it. Now, we could see more HP scaling characters in future, or even sword-wielding HP scaling healers that could use this weapon, but as of right now, only Cartethyia can use it. So her other current options are the standard weapon Emerald of Genesis, which will give a good amount of crit rate as well as energy recharge, which can make building her a bit easier and critting a bit more reliable. Camellia's weapon Red Spring is slightly better even when Emerald of Genesis is rank 5, as it also has a crit rate sub, as well as a good amount of easily proccable basic attack damage bonus. Lastly, Brant's weapon Unflickering Valor is an okay option, despite being worse than both Red Spring and Emerald of Genesis, as it gives a shitload of energy recharge, gives a small amount of crit rate, and has a ton of easily proccable basic attack damage bonuses. So she does have some other options, and there really isn't a right answer for what weapon you should use. However, I will give a general recommendation for a few different situations. If you don't have Shakona, her weapon is really good to pick up, turning her into a pretty reliable hypercarry DPS in both solo and team play. If you do have Shakona and you're free to play, I would recommend using one of the other options for now and wait to see if we get more HP scalers in future. If we do, you can pick up her weapon on a rerun. However, ultimately you should try to get both Cartethia's weapon and Shakona, as her weapon is insanely strong, and Shakona is a very general aero support character with a lot of use cases. The only reason I didn't personally try to get Shakona was Zani took priority, and after I summoned for Zani and her weapon, I wouldn't have had enough for both Cartethyia and her weapon as well. Also, if you like Cartethia's playstyle and you're a light spender, her weapon is an insanely good damage boost for her, and I would recommend getting it if you can. I would also recommend for light spenders that this might be the character to spend your corals on for her S2, and if you can swing it, maybe try getting her S3 as well. The reason for this is she is an insanely strong character on her own, and if we get a good aero sub DPS or healer character in future, an S2 or S3 Cartethyia would easily migrate to a new team without feeling like losing Shakona or Aero Rover would be too hard to manage. I would have personally tried to get her S2 and maybe even her S3 if I wasn't dead set on staying at S0R1 with my characters so that I can solo content with them in future. So to summarize, free-to-play players should go for a weapon if they don't have Shakona. However, you could also consider waiting for Shakona's rerun, as I would argue she's more valuable to your account. If you do have Shakona, I would at least put a few pulls into the weapon banner, but if you don't get it early, even Emerald of Genesis will do fine for now. Light spenders should go to S0R1 and consider maybe even going to S2 or S3 if you don't care about characters feeling way too strong. And lastly, for whales, this is definitely a character worth investing in, so go as far as you're comfortable. Now, with all of that out of the way, we're going to start with the most important part of the video, being how to build her, the teams she can use, how you should build her different teams, and also how you can play these different teams. Let's get started with her build. Her best in slot set is Windward Pilgrimage. This set will allow Cartethyia to gain a passive 10% aero damage bonus, as well as 30% aero damage bonus and 10% crit rate for 10 seconds when hitting an enemy who has aero erosion. This is honestly the only set I would ever consider putting her on, as it's not only far better than the other options in both team play and soloing, but it also gives her access to the echo skill Reminiscence, which will give her another 20% aero damage bonus for just having it equipped in the main slot. You can also run Kelpie, as it will deal a large amount of aero damage to the target when you use her outro skill. However, it only gives 12% aero damage bonus, so it's not as strong for Cartethia's damage output. A close second echo set though is Gusts of Welkin, as this will allow her to run the same main echoes, being Reminiscence or Kelpie, but it will also give a similar amount of aero damage bonus to Cartethyia after she inflicts aero erosion for 15 seconds. The only difference between these two sets is 15% of this aero damage bonus is also granted to the whole team, which can be good if you're running a second aero DPS character. However, it doesn't have the 10% crit rate, so it's much better suited for a sub DPS that can inflict aero erosion, such as Shakona, or in some instances Aero Rover. As for Sierra Gale, I would only recommend using this set if it's all you currently have access to, and if you are running this, you should try to replace this as quickly as possible. The best build for Cartethyia is 44111, and based off my different combinations using the Wuthering Tools calculator, this applies no matter if you're running her signature, Red Spring, or Emerald of Genesis. You want to aim for crit rate or damage as your 4-cost main stats, with 1 of each if you have a signature, and 2 crit damage if you're running Red Spring or Emerald of Genesis. However, if you plan to just try her with one of these options for now and maybe get her signature on her rerun, you could consider running 1 crit rate and 1 crit damage for more consistent crits, as well as making your build more future-proof for when you eventually get her signature. As for her 1 costs, run HP % main stat for all 3 of them. Your substat priority should be crit rate and damage, then HP %, then try to aim for around 110 to 115% energy regen, and finally basic attack bonus and flat HP are both good. However, basic attack will lead to higher overall DPS, whereas flat HP will lead to a general increase in damage for all of her abilities, including her Liberation. So if you want to see the biggest numbers from her Liberation's final hit while maintaining a good amount of damage increase for her other abilities, go with flat HP. Otherwise, go with basic attack for higher DPS. Now, Liberation damage bonus is better than flat HP at increasing the damage of her final attack. However, as this only affects the final hit, which doesn't make up much of her damage output, this should be seen as more of a nice to have if your gear has it. This can be the case with skill damage as well, but heavy damage bonus, attack %, and flat attack will all be completely dead stats on her. So with that out of the way, let's go over her team, starting with her best in slot, which is Cartethyia, Shakona, and Aero Rover. Now, I have 2 different variations for this team, with one of them being a more standard team, and the other one being something I can't verify works, as I don't own Shakona and can't experiment with her. The first standard team option, you run Cartethyia on Windward Pilgrimage with the Reminiscence Echo, Shakona on Gusts of Welkin with either Kelpie for better scaling or Reminiscence for better usage during during combat. And last, Aero Rover with the Blood Pack's Pledge weapon on the Rejuvenating Glow set with either Bell or Fallacy as your Echo. If you want to buff Cartethyia, Fallacy won't be able to buff her at all as it grants an attack percent buff for the team for 20 seconds. However, Bell will grant a damage buff for the team for 15 seconds or for as long as you have the Bell shield, which will last for 3 hits. I would still recommend Fallacy just because of its ease of use, and the buff from Bell is very likely to expire before it's useful on Cartethyia anyway, so you'd be better off buffing Shakona for longer. In this team, Shakona will buff everyone in the team with 24% more aero damage bonus, as well as amplifying aero erosion damage by 100%. If you have a weapon, this will also reduce the aero resistance of enemies she applies aero erosion to by 10 to 16% for 20 seconds. She will also be very helpful at grouping and maintaining aero erosion stacks on all enemies within her liberation. Aero Rover's weapon will amplify aero damage for the whole team by 10 to 26% for 30 seconds after using their enhanced skill. And their outro will give a buff to the whole team for 30 seconds that when they hit an enemy will increase the cap for aero erosion by 3 for 10 seconds. Cartethyia will mostly be the selfish main DPS, but her outro skill will amplify aero damage for the team by 17.5% for 20 seconds against enemies with negative statuses, and she will also shorten Aero Rover's rotation slightly. This team's rotation is very simple, doing Aero Rover's rotation being sure to use their enhanced skill before their outro. Shakona can then group enemies, increase the team's aero damage before using her liberation and outroing to Cartethyia, who will create and recall her swords, use her liberation transformation, build up her liberation forte while triggering erosion stacks as Shakona continues to replace them, before finally using her ultimate liberation and swapping back to Aero Rover to repeat the process. This is a very cookie cutter team and will do its job with the simple rotation that I just mentioned. However, if you want to get a bit more damage out of this team, be sure to try creating and recalling her 3 swords twice in one rotation. When you have 3 recalled swords, her enhanced plunge is a really hard hitting ability that is considered as aero erosion damage. There are a few places that you can fit this into her rotation, and it doesn't really matter when you do it. However, the best place to do it in my opinion would be after your final liberation ability, so that the enemies have the aero erosion negative status and your team can take advantage of Cartethyia's outro skill right from the get-go. Now, another team option which I can't verify works well is instead of running Aero Rover on Rejuvenating Glow with Bell or Fallacy, you can instead run them on Moonlit with Heron. This would make you have to perform a pretty weird rotation though in order to take full advantage of it, where you'd have to use your enhanced skill on Aero Rover but not outro onto Shakona, then outro from Shakona onto Aero Rover, and then outro from Aero Rover onto Cartethyia. The only reason you would run this build over the first option is to make Cartethyia do the most damage possible, as Heron gives a 12% damage buff for 15 seconds, which is unlike Bell's 10% for 15 seconds that can also be removed prematurely if you take 3 hits. The Rejuvenating Glow set on Aero Rover is also useless for Cartethyia as it grants an attack buff for the whole team. Now, Moonlit is equally as useless, but access to Heron would make it better for this purpose. However, the downside to doing this is this team build and rotation will only buff Cartethyia, with Shakona not receiving any benefit. This team also doesn't work if you're planning to quick swap, so even though it has the potential for higher damage numbers on Cartethyia, I would still recommend the first team option as it's not only easier to pull off, but it would also be more reliable overall. However, if you don't have Shakona, your next team option is Cartethyia, Senhua, and Aero Rover. As Cartethyia mostly deals basic attack damage, Senhua is an awesome buffer for her, allowing her to do a good amount of damage with most of her abilities. However, without Shakona, you will need to play in a specific way in order to be able to take full advantage of Aero Rover's outro. So let's quickly run through a rotation for this team, where Senhua will be on Moonlit with Heron, and Rover will be on Rejuvenating Glow with Bell and Blood Pack's Pledge. Rover will start the fight building Concerto and Forte before using their liberation, followed by the Bell Echo skill, the Enhanced skill, and finally swapping off with an outro to Senhua. Senhua performs her rotation as fast as possible to build Concerto before using Heron and outroing to Cartethyia. This is where Cartethia's rotation has many different options, as her Fleurdelys rotation especially is very flexible with how you perform it. However, I'll run through my favorite rotation. Cartethia's intro skill will apply 2 stacks of aero erosion. We then perform our full basic attack combo into basic attack 4 to apply another stack. As soon as the basic attack 4 animation starts, we cancel this with our skill to apply 2 more stacks before recalling our 3 swords by doing an enhanced plunge attack and entering our liberation. At this point, the enemy should have 5 stacks of air erosion. We then use Fleurdelys' skill, followed by her mid-air combo 1 and 2 before using her second skill. This will lead into her basic attack 3, where we'll continue her basic combo until we hear the sword hit from her basic attack 5. When we hear this hit, we immediately use Avatar to swap to Cartethyia. Over the course of Fleurdelys' attacks in this rotation, this might consume 3 air erosion stacks, which will leave the enemy with 2, while also filling most of our liberation forte. However, swapping to Cartethyia before basic attack 5 will allow the damage to still hit the enemy and generate forte for her liberation, but won't consume the 3rd air erosion stack, which should leave the enemy with 3 stacks. From this point, we add 1 more stack and the second sword with her basic attack 4, cancel the basic attack 4 with her heavy attack to create the first sword, then do some regular attacks until you can use her skill, which will give us the last 2 stacks and the 3rd sword, before finally doing her enhanced plunge attack to recall the swords. This should give us all 6 stacks of air erosion. As her plunge attack hits the ground, swap back to Fleurdelys and either do some regular attacks or her first skill again, as it should be off cooldown, and once her forte is full, use her liberation. From this point, you can swap to Arrow Rover and repeat the process. Now, something that I'll mention here, if you compare this rotation to how I normally play her, I also add the mid-air combo 3 before the second skill. However, this is just a personal preference and I wouldn't recommend people to do this because it's an insanely weak attack in terms of damage and it isn't really worth the drop in DPS. The only reason I still do this though is I quite like the feeling of being able to do 2 ground slams in quick succession. But for someone who doesn't own Shakona, this is the team I've been using, and even though my Arrow Rover has basically no gear and my Senhua has a level 1 weapon, this team has still been clearing the content just fine. Having said that, you do have some other options in terms of teammates. I also tried replacing Arrow Rover with a healer like Shorekeeper, and this team was not only more consistent, but was also able to perform slightly better in the current Tower of Adversity. So if you're going to run this team, you should also invest into your Senhua and Rover more than myself, so their damage can pick up the slack of not having a dedicated healer with healer buffs. The only reason I currently prefer Arrow Rover with no gear over Shorekeeper is this frees up my Shorekeeper for another team. Otherwise, Shorekeeper is still really valuable as she provides a shitload of healing, has a death save for the team, does her rotation really fast, and also gives those juicy crit rate and damage buffs. Lastly, a replacement option you have for Senhua is Alto. Alto won't let Cartethyia do as much damage and will have a longer rotation. However, he comes with a taunt increasing your team's survivability, amplifies all arrow damage on his outro skill by 23%, which includes your liberation and skill. However, this does not affect arrow erosion damage. And finally, if you somehow picked up Shakona's weapon but didn't get Shakona, equipping this on Alto will allow Cartethyia to hit harder than with Senhua's basic attack amplification. However, you would need to adjust your rotation for it to work, as her weapon requires him to hit an enemy who has at least 1 stack of arrow erosion. But that's everything to do with Cartethyia out of the way. So what's my opinion on her overall? She is an awesome character. She's not only really well designed, has a great personality, gets essentially a boss form where she just wrecks anything you put in front of her, has a really good signature weapon but doesn't feel like she needs it to be useful, has some of the best survivability in the game even though she consumes her own health, as she can heal it back relatively quickly, but most importantly, she feels like Kuro understood the problems players had with Zani and were determined to give her everything that she needed to function in her own kit. This means that she doesn't need a specific type of teammate like Shakona or Arrow Rover, but she will excel when put in that environment. This is such a good direction to take off the back of all the Doom posting that Cartethyia was just going to be the same as Zani, or comments like that's just how negative status teams are. Now, something that I will admit, I do feel like she was a little bit overtuned, because some of the solo times I was able to set with her against the holograms were really close to some of the scores I had set with full teams. However, her being a little bit overtuned might have been intended, as another opinion that I have is even though Shakona is a really good arrow and arrow erosion support, and Arrow Rover works really well with their weapon, I don't think she currently has her best in slot team yet. I think it's possible we see a replacement for the Rejuvenating Glow set at some point, as both Fallacy and Belle feel suboptimal, and the Rejuvenating Glow set buffs attack, which Cartethyia can't use. This also somewhat applies to the Moonlit set, however we already kinda have a better replacement for that, being Gusts of Welkin. It also feels like Aero Rover and Shakona could be replaced eventually, as a future Aero and basic attack amplifier could outshine Shakona depending on how much value they bring to the team, and Aero Rover could be replaced by a healer who provides buffs that scale better with non-attack scaling units. Out of these two characters, I think Rover has a higher likelihood of getting kicked out of the team eventually, and I would much rather see a dedicated support for Gian before we get one for Cartethyia anyway. I also believe Shakona will always have value in some game modes like Whimpering Wastes, so even if we do see a better amplifier, it would likely only be better at single target, which I wouldn't mind. However, my original point was, Kuro might have overtuned her on purpose, because most characters and buffs in the game currently benefit attack scaling characters, and Kuro might not plan on giving her better teammates or echo sets anytime soon. But there are so many things that I just love about this character, as she really does feel like Kuro put a lot of effort in when designing her playstyle. However, just like everyone else, she does have some issues I found. Fleurdelys' dodge counter doesn't get iframes for the full counter's duration. The reason this is bad is it also gets a soft animation lock that won't let you dodge out of this attack while the animation is still active. This means there are certain attacks that she just can't deal with a really good example being Dirge's Fire Breath attack. Now, luckily she gets to switch back to Cartethyia during Manifest, but this is still a shame nonetheless, as it can make her feel worse unnecessarily. She also has a lot of camera issues, with the most noticeable being during her ultimate liberation, where it feels like it remains higher in the air for longer than it should. This can be made a bit worse by the fact that after her liberation, she loses her iframes before she regains the ability to dodge. However, you can swap off during this time, so it's not so bad. The camera also tends to slowly zoom in over time during some of her attack combos, which can make some fights really frustrating. Another thing that I noticed was you can see the quality difference between Cartethyia and Fleurdelys' models, as Fleurdelys seems to be a lower resolution. I think what Kuro did is they just took the existing boss model for Fleurdelys and didn't try to increase the quality when making her a playable character. So I really hope Kuro consider making a high definition model for her in future, as in my opinion, she's one of the most visually appealing characters Kuro's brought to the game so far. One of the issues that both Cartethyia and Fleurdelys have is they both have attacks that reposition them as part of the attack's animation. And because Kuro still hasn't fixed attacks that have lingering damage, this can have them quickly move into the attack's radius and getting hit without the player even realizing why. This was really noticeable on Inferno Rider, and I had to do multiple restarts of that fight because I would try to position myself correctly only to have these attacks screw me over. Now, I do like the idea of certain attacks having these quick moving hitboxes, as styling players will likely be able to take advantage of this to avoid some attacks. However, I don't like attacks that do this at the expense of making combat feel clunky. So in my opinion, Kuro either needs to give those repositions iframes, or they need to fix or remove lingering damage from certain attacks. I really hope to see them do the latter, as I've been bitching about lingering damage for a while now. A really important part of her kit is Cartethyia's skill, as it will not only supply the third sword for your buffs and enhance plunge attack, but it will also put 2 stacks of arrow erosion on the enemy. Now, I do like this skill, and it's actually really good at parrying. However, the range on it doesn't quite feel like it's big enough, as it will often miss at some distances that feel like they should have hit. Cartethia's dodge counter ability can cause the enemy to do this weird stutter instead of being just slowed, which can not only make follow-up attacks harder to read, which isn't that hard to get used to, and once you get the hang of it can even be helpful in some scenarios, but it can also make fights a lot less cinematic, as the enemy animation kind of looks like they're lagging, which can take away the immersion of a fight. Another issue I have is Fleurdelys' stagnate ability that her basic attack 4 gets when you have the virtue buff can also make enemy attacks harder to deal with. This wouldn't be an issue if you could prematurely end the stagnate by dashing out of the attack. However, this again can also be helpful in certain scenarios, so it's not a big issue. Because of the way she spawns her falling swords and recalls them, there's a limit to how fast you can perform different rotations. Now, the regular rotation of intro skill, basic attack 4, skill and then recall, or basic attack 4, heavy attack, skill and then recall, won't have this issue when recalling the swords and getting the buffs. However, trying to quickly perform a plunge attack attack after both her basic attack 4 and her heavy attack can cause her to summon the sword after the plunge attack. Now, this isn't an issue on its own, as it's just something that you get used to, which I haven't quite mastered yet. However, the issue that I have is the ready to recall and recall symbols on her forte gauge are so similar that at a glance, they can be hard to tell which state they're in. I often mess this up during my solo video, as I was too busy paying attention to the boss and would just check out of the corner of my eye. Now, I doubt this will change as it's such a small issue, but it would be nice if the recalled state was a different color like gold, so there would be an obvious difference between when the buff was charged and when it still needed to be. This can also be made a bit worse, as there's currently a bug where if you perform a heavy attack and jump cancel the animation so you can use her skill quicker, if you hold down the button for too long, she will instead automatically perform a plunge attack, which will ruin you being able to use your enhanced plunge. This isn't a big deal, as it's a bug that involves exploiting the way animations in the game work. However, it also feels like it shouldn't work the way it currently does. Now, it is possible to use this strategy to cancel, however it's so finicky that unless you really need that ever so slightly faster rotation, it really isn't worth learning. One thing that I found to be a pain in the ass when building her was how shit getting her echoes felt. She almost requires you to spend about 2 to 3 hours a day just farming echoes to try and get a good set for her. And to make things worse, both Kelpie and Reminiscence are both dual set echoes that you can spend hours farming only to get fuck all of the main stat you're actually looking for on the right set. I, no joke, spent a full hour farming Fleurdelys only to get one crit main stat on the Winwood set. And I wasn't even looking for a specific main stat at the time, as either crit rate or damage would have worked. Having said that, I consider myself to be pretty lucky, as I got my full set within the first few days. However, if you're trying to build her by mostly farming the tacit fields, you'll likely be grinding for a while to get her on a build you're happy with. Now, I do think this might be good that this happened though, as this is something people were complaining about back in 1.0 with Belle, so I really hope Kuro finally considers making character building a better experience for the average player. Another thing that can be a bit annoying right now is her team options. I mentioned before that she might not have her best in slot team yet, and I have seen some criticism about how Cartethyia is too team restrictive, with some people referencing Zani for a comparison. Now, in terms of team options that she works with, I actually agree with this. We don't have a lot of options in terms of characters that not only work with HP scalers, but we're also lacking in strong aero supports. However, in terms of her being similar to Zani, she is nowhere even close to being as restrictive as Zani. For an example, Zani without Spectrofrazzle in the team will just feel like a hindrance, as she offers very little if your team doesn't support her. Cartethyia, on the other hand, will function just fine in a team that doesn't support her, because she has everything that she needs to function within her own kit. So I don't necessarily disagree with what some people have been saying, as I would really like to see Aero get some better supporting characters, and I would even like to see some healers that work better with non-attack scaling units. However, in my opinion, comparing her with Zani is a bit of a knee-jerk reaction, as she's nowhere near that bad. Lastly, most of her abilities are really flashy, which can make some enemies hard to follow and read their attacks. I've mentioned this before in a previous video that Kuro should add something in the settings where you can turn down your own team's effects and better pay attention to what the enemy is doing. Cartethyia is yet another character that could definitely benefit from this, as some bosses in the game can be hard to keep track of. So those are some of the issues she has, but luckily they are all rather minor issues, which makes her one of the better characters in the game in my opinion. But before we get into my final thoughts, let's go over some tips and tricks that I've found while using her. If you're struggling to get Cartethyia to perform her enhanced plunge because of some enemy attacks, the Reminiscence Echo skill is actually really good at creating a decent opening, as it slows down the animations of enemies it hits for a short period of time, and I found a good time to take advantage of this was during her basic attack 3 or 4 before you use her skill. She also has a fair few attacks that are really good at parrying. Some good examples are Cartethyia's heavy attack and skill, and Fleurdelys' basic attack 3, basic attack 4, and her first skill. Now, it's worth mentioning that Cartethyia's basic attack 3 and 4 can be good at parrying as well. However, due to certain issues with how parrying works for some attacks, these can be very temperamental at times, so it's best to treat these with a bit more caution than confidence. Fleurdelys is not only good at avoiding some low to the ground attacks, even being able to just idle through some of them, but both characters can also be good at avoiding the ground in general. They can both maintain themselves in the air, with Cartethyia being able to do it really easily with her skill, and Fleurdelys gets a proper mid-air dodge that she can use multiple times, making her a very strong aerial character. A quick fun fact, switching from Fleurdelys to Cartethyia will reset Cartethyia's mid-air dodge, so you never have to worry about switching in and being dodge locked. Now, despite me saying that Fleurdelys has a good dodge, I've also said earlier her dodge counter can be pretty shit against some attacks. However, to compensate for this, Cartethyia has, in my opinion, one of the best dodge counters in the game, giving plenty of iframes for its duration, while also doing a small reposition during the attack. The reason I think the little reposition is important is a bug that currently exists in combat is attacks hitting you through your dodge and dodge counters iframes. And my suspicion is this is happening during the transition between your dodge and dodge counter states. However, despite this being a current issue for most characters, I never once encountered this problem with Cartethyia. As Cartethyia's enhanced plunge attack is considered as aero erosion damage, and Fleurdelys's divinity buff amplifies aero erosion, she can actually amplify this damage herself, provided you have good ping and good timing. The way you can do this is as soon as she lands from the plunge attack, if you quickly switch to Fleurdelys, this can amplify some of the damage that happens during Manifest, which can increase your DPS. If you ever need to switch back to Cartethyia, but you accidentally overcap your Liberation Forte, the grapple hook can be your best friend. Now, this might not work in future as it might not be intended and Kuro might patch it. However, for now, this can be a pretty good safety net, especially if you don't have Shakona and need to switch back to Cartethyia to reapply aero erosion. Fleurdelys' stack triggering from certain attacks will only happen when playing as Fleurdelys and can be cancelled by switching back to Cartethyia before they trigger. This can allow her to do the damage from her abilities without proccing their effects. We mentioned how this worked with her basic attack 5 when going through her rotation, and some of her other abilities can work in a very similar way. When you're farming her 4-cost echoes, fight both Fleurdelys and Kelpie to determine which of the two is easier and faster to beat. Then what you can try to do is try to get a crit rate or damage main stat echo that you're happy with from the harder boss first, as this will allow you to roll both main stats on the echoes you obtain. Then once you have this echo, you can farm the easier boss for the opposite main stat. I would recommend doing Fleurdelys first and then Kelpie, as even though you can fight the level 80 version of Fleurdelys, the loading screen between fights can take up a lot of time. Lastly, if an enemy is preparing an attack while setting up your enhanced plunge, dodging out of the recall plunge will waste the enhanced attack if she doesn't touch the ground. So try not to spam the attack button to do the plunge unless you have enough of an opening. Overall, Cartethyia is one of the best characters in the game that I would honestly recommend everyone to pull for, as even with most of the issues she has, she's still an absolute pleasure to play. However, like I mentioned in the issues, her team options can be a bit restricted right now, and with her being the first HP scaling DPS in the game, we have no idea how frequently we're going to see characters who work with this type of scaling. So if this is something that concerns you, I would recommend that you skip her for now and wait to see what happens with future units. Now, the downside of this is you'll likely miss out on having fun with her right now, but you can always pick her up on her rerun. But that will do it for the video. So I'd like to thank you so much for watching. If you enjoyed the video or you got something useful out of it, feel free to leave a like or a comment. And if you'd like to see more content in future, you can subscribe to the channel. One more thing I'd like to say though, I do feel like it's a shame that Kuro ran the banners the way they did, as I imagine most people didn't give Shakona the chance to show how good she was, because like myself, we were saving for Cartethyia. So I really hope that Kuro either reconsider how they're releasing their characters going forward, or they plan out their schedule a lot better. But that will do it from me, so I hope to see you in the next video, and I'll catch you later.